Menorca is 2 islands. And Menorca is the smaller of the 2 Islas Baleares. 2 other convention statements you may think, but absolutely true. Today you'll find out why. You're all staying here on the Miggiorno side of Menorca. It's named after the Miggiorno, the midday wind, which during the summer months will spring up about 1 o'clock. And although it's a warm wind, a southerly wind, having started its life on the deserts of North Africa, it's cooled by the 195 miles of water as it comes across from Algeria. It brings the temperatures down somewhat from where they'd easily be exceeding 40 degrees to a sort of sensible, and I say in inverted commas, sensible 33 to 35 degrees. The Miggiorno side of Menorca is a flat limestone plateau, cut through by 8 ravines. It's only there where you'll find any trees whatsoever. The rest is just all scrub. Hardly any soil on the surface, lots and lots of limestone rock, and tiny little fields, especially down on the southeast corner, the original tanques or enclosures. It was formed at the same time as the youngest range of mountains in the whole of Europe, the Sierra Nevada mountains, which run along the back of the Costa del Sol from Granada. Its foothills, the Alpujarra mountains, which disappear into the sea at Calpe and Denia, and then re-emerge as the furthest easterly peak of that range of mountains, the southern side of Menorca. It was formed during the 3rd era of geology, the Mycenaean era, approximately 10 million years ago. Later on this morning, we'll be going across to the Tramontana side. The Tramontana side takes up 1/3 of the island, has our rolling hills, our forested areas, large fields, plenty of beautiful red soil on the surface, and an underlying stone of granite and sandstone. It was formed at the same time as the oldest range of mountains, the Massif, which run along the back of the Comarca fronts, and the northern part of Menorca forms the furthest southerly tip of that range of mountains. And it was formed some 400 million years ago. So we've got 2 islands, very distinct, that were formed some 390 million years apart, give or take a day or 2 of course, with a fault line which meanders down the island where you can easily discern one sort of rock overlying the other, and starting with a natural fissure where those rocks didn't meet, the huge, very deep harbour of Mahon. Where the first people came from to inhabit this island is pure conjecture. Thought, however, to be a race of people who drifted across the Mediterranean, hauled out tree trunks, roughly made rafts, from either the island of Sardinia, which is 190 miles east of us, or from the coast of France, some 220 miles north of us. And they lived in caves, those people. Officially, they would be called Gauls, as indeed the whole of France was called Gaul at that time. But most people referred to them as troglodytes because they lived in those caves. They arrived here some 5,000 years ago. The Bronze Age, which took 1,800 years from its origins in the Middle East to drift down the Mediterranean and eventually arrive in, literally in the British Isles, was very modern in those eras anyway, when it arrived here some 900 years into the Bronze Age. And they were immediately shown how to husband animals, clear little plots of land for their own immediate family needs, run a few chickens, a goat or 2, a cow, and also grow vegetables. And those people also built villages. In fact, Menorca is a veritable open-air archaeological museum with more prehistoric sites from the Bronze Age between 3,500 and 4,500 years ago. than any other place, not only in Europe but perhaps the world. We have over 300 villages, over 2,000 monuments, all to be seen to this day. The people to start talking and spreading the word to what we would now call first world countries about Menorca were the Phoenicians. That peace-loving race of merchants that plied the Mediterranean from their ports at the eastern end, and making their way to and from the salt mines of Tarsus, which still exist, although not used now, but can be seen, up the Guadalquivir River in the province of Huelva in Andalusia on the Portuguese-Spanish border. They were afraid to come ashore here for centuries. They stated that the islanders were savages, that they poured out of tumuli or hills, that they ran naked in summer. Well, so would you if you were here during this past June, July and August. And that they were pelted very accurately with thousands upon thousands of stones whenever those little ships came near the shoreline. So although they were frightened to come ashore, they did give this island its first name. They called it Nura, N-U-R-A, which in the Arabic Semitic language of that era meant land of fire. For the simple reason that it is apparent that the islanders would light bonfires on the highest points of their villages to warn each other of approaching ships. And you can imagine with a little island just 35 miles long by 12 miles wide at its widest point, with some 300 of those bonfires raging, from those little fleets of ships on the southern sea, it must indeed have looked as if it was a fire. It wasn't until the year 800 BC that one of those fleets of ships did in fact make landfall for the first time. They came ashore in a little cove where they found fresh water bubbling to the surface, and were not only able to fill their water barrels from those freshwater springs, but also replenish their stocks of food from the fruits, berries and game from the forests which came right down to the sea at that time. The Phoenicians called that little cove Calas Fonts. Well, in fact, it's in Calas Fonts that my wife and I have lived for the last 26 years. But on further exploration, they found that that cove was just one of many in a huge natural anchorage. They thought of it as a shield or shelter. In fact, that's exactly what they called it. Again, in the Semitic Arabic language of that era, they called it Magen. And since that day, 800 years ago, or should I say 800 years before Christ, Mahan Harbour, as we now know it, the world's second largest deep water natural harbour after Pearl Harbor in the Pacific, well, it's been a fantastic shield or shelter for thousands of fleets of ships and from hundreds of different nations. It's the reason why this island has developed the way it has, why it's been attacked by so many nations over the centuries, why it became a crown colony of Great Britain all the way through the 18th century, why the people of Menorca are so highly cultured, highly educated, and are amongst the wealthiest in the whole of Europe, and I mean that in every sense of the word wealthy. Why this island is so unique and shouldn't be compared to any other place in the Mediterranean, and especially any other part of Spain. It is totally on its own. Phoenicians didn't set up a trading post, or they didn't settle on the island, but they did set up a trading post at the inland end, which took its name from the harbour. Eventually it was the Romans who arrived in the year 123 BC who inhabited this island for the first time for any nation outside of Menorca. They were here until the end of the 4th century AD. They didn't leave too much of a heritage on Menorca, but they did leave the island's names as we now know them, or virtually the same as we now know them. They named the two islands after those famous slingers of Menorca, those men and boys that had been encountered by the Phoenicians and were used not only by the Romans, but also by the Carthaginians, the Greeks and the Turks as frontline troops in all their battles throughout Europe. In fact, there is documented evidence that a huge contingent of Menorcan slingers actually accompanied Hannibal across the Alps with his elephants on his way to invade Rome. The Romans called a slinger a stone thrower. They called him a barriere, and so the two islands became known as Islas Baleares, the islands of the slingers. And they had a large island and a small island. The large island they called Majorica, the major island, and the smaller island, Minorica, the minor island. And it's from those two words, of course, we get today's Mallorca and Menorca. Forgive me if you've been to Ibiza or Formentera, but in fact you went to one of the Pitusus Islands. There are only two Islas Baleares. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the island went through its worst period of history ever, always being under attack by various nations, and in the main taking slaves to row the galleys, or in the case of the Barbary Coast pirates from across the water in Algeria, to work in those palaces as pirates. It's an amazing fact that during the 14th century and the very first census of what we would perhaps term the modern era, the population of Menorca amounted to less than 5,000 people. However, scientists during the 1960s and archaeologists have worked out that the population of Menorca during the Bronze Age, between 3,500 and 4,500 years ago, was some 30,000 people. It had been diminished so much, not only by taking slaves, but also by looting all their livestock and food, leaving the island to starve, on certain occasions introducing diseases which the islanders weren't used to and therefore died from. The saviours of Menorca by far, in what we would term the Middle Ages, were the Arabs, the Muslims, or the Moors as the Spanish called them. They arrived here much later than other parts of Spain. They arrived here literally in the latter part of the 10th century, and we're here until the end of the 13th century. Just 300 years, but they left a huge mark on this island. Most of our place names are Arabic, of origin of Arabic anyway. 80 to 85% of all the dry stone walls on the island, or some 7,500 miles of dry stone walls, were built during those 300 years by the Arabs. Much of our architecture, agriculture and irrigation was established by the Arabs. However, in the year 1286, there were 17 kingdoms in Spain. The same as the 17 autonomous governmental regions to this day, all with their own devolved governments. A bit like the devolved Parliament of Scotland and the Welsh Assembly, but with many, many, many more powers. And the most up-to-date of all of those kingdoms was Catalonia and Aragon. Perhaps the most